It was just a photo of two friends on the beach. Upon zooming in, experts noticed a terrifying truth. Dr. Elizabeth Morrison sat in her office at the Smithsonian Institution on a cold February morning in 2024, scrolling through a digital archive of civil rights-era photographs. The rain tapped steadily against her window, creating a rhythm that had become the soundtrack to countless hours of research. She had spent the last decade studying the visual documentation of the desegregation movement, particularly the lesser-known acts of resistance that never made it into history textbooks. The image that stopped her scrolling seemed innocuous at first, almost mundane in its simplicity. Two young women, perhaps in their early 20s, stood side by side on a white sand beach. Both wore fashionable 1950s swimsuits and dark sunglasses, their hair styled in the elegant waves popular during that era. The woman on the left was white, with dark curled hair and a bright smile. The woman on the right was black, her natural hair styled beautifully, her expression radiating joy and confidence. They stood close together, comfortable in each other's presence, as if posing for nothing more significant than a vacation snapshot. But Elizabeth knew better. She had studied enough photographs from the 1950s South to recognize what made this image extraordinary. In 1956, the dates stamped on the back of the original print beaches throughout Florida were strictly segregated. White and black Americans did not share the same sand, the same water, or the same space. The idea of two women of different races standing together in swimsuits, relaxed and friendly, was not just unusual. It was dangerous. Elizabeth leaned closer to her screen, her trained eye beginning to notice details that the casual observer might miss. The quality of the photograph was remarkably good for the era-sharp focus. Well composed, clearly taken by someone who knew what they were doing. This wasn't a casual snapshot taken by a friend. This was deliberate documentation. She zoomed in on the background and her breath caught. Behind the two women, scattered across the beach at various distances, were figures. Men in white shirts and dark trousers, some with their arms crossed, others with hands on their hips. Their postures were unmistakable. They were watching, waiting. Elizabeth counted at least 7 men visible in the frame, and she suspected there were more outside the camera's view. "What were you two doing?" Elizabeth whispered to the smiling faces on her screen. "And who was watching you?" She saved the image and began cross-referencing it with her database of civil rights protests and demonstrations. Nothing came up. No record of a beach protest in Miami in 1956. No newspaper coverage. No arrest records that she could find in the initial search. It was as if this moment had been deliberately erased from history. Elizabeth picked up her phone to call her research assistant Marcus, then hesitated. Something told her this photograph was different from the countless others she had studied. The women's expressions, fearless yet aware, joyful yet purposeful, suggested they knew exactly what they were doing and what it might cost them. Elizabeth spent the next 4 hours meticulously examining every detail of the photograph. She increased the resolution, adjusted the contrast and brightness, and applied various enhancement filters to reveal elements invisible in the original scan. Her coffee grew cold beside her keyboard, forgotten as she worked through the technical analysis that had become second nature after years of studying historical images. The beach appeared to be somewhere in South Florida, the distinctive white sand and the palm trees. Visible in the far distance suggested Miami or Fort Lauderdale. The angle of the shadows indicated the photograph was taken in late afternoon, probably around 4 or 5 o'clock. The two women cast long shadows on the sand, and the light had that golden quality characteristic of approaching sunset. The photographer had positioned them perfectly to take advantage of this flattering natural light. But it was the figures in the background that consumed Elizabeth's attention. She isolated each one, enlarging and enhancing them individually. The man closest to the women, standing perhaps 20 feet behind them to the left, wore what appeared to be a police uniform. She could make out the distinctive shape of a badge on his chest and a belt with equipment attached. His arms were crossed over his chest, and even in the grainy enlargement, his expression appeared stern and disapproving. His stance was that of someone prepared to intervene at any moment. Further back, near a cluster of beach chairs and umbrellas, 3 men in civilian clothes stood together in a tight group, all facing toward the two women. One pointed in their direction, his arm extended and finger clearly aimed at them. Another appeared to be speaking, his mouth open mid-sentence, possibly shouting. The third man had his hands on his hips in a posture of confrontation. Their body language radiated hostility and tension, the kind of aggressive surveillance that spoke of imminent action. On the right side of the frame, partially obscured by a striped beach umbrella, Elizabeth could make out another figure holding what looked like a camera with a large flash attachment. This person was also photographing the scene, but from a different angle, suggesting coordinated documentation of whatever was happening on that beach. The presence of multiple photographers indicated this was a planned event, not a spontaneous moment. Elizabeth leaned back and studied the overall composition one more time. The two women stood in the center of the frame, relaxed and smiling, while tension radiated from every figure surrounding them. The contrast was stark and deliberate. This was not an accidental photograph. This was a statement captured on film. Elizabeth contacted the Historical Society in Boston that had received Catherine Reeves's estate donation. After several phone calls and email exchanges, she arranged to have the remaining materials from the collection digitized and sent to her. 3 days later, a massive file arrived in her inbox containing scans of letters, diary entries, newspaper clippings, and several more photographs. She opened the first document, a diary entry dated May 15, 1956, written in elegant cursive handwriting. I met the most remarkable woman today at the Fellowship Church gathering. Her name is Dorothy, and she teaches elementary school in Overtown. We talked for 3 hours about everything: literature, music, politics, faith. She has a perspective on this country that I, in my privileged whiteness, have never fully understood. She told me about the daily humiliations of segregation, how she cannot eat at most restaurants, cannot try on clothes in department stores, cannot even drink from the same water fountains. I felt ashamed of my ignorance and angry at the injustice. Dorothy laughed, not cruelly, but with a kind of weary understanding, and said that anger is good if it leads to action. I think I have found not just a friend, but a purpose. Elizabeth's pulse quickened as she read. This was Catherine, the white woman in the photograph, and Dorothy was clearly her companion. She continued reading through the diary entries, watching their friendship develop over the following weeks. Catherine wrote about meeting Dorothy for coffee at integrated churches and private homes, the only places they could socialize without violating segregation laws. She wrote about introducing Dorothy to her family when they visited from Boston, and her father's uncomfortable disapproval. Then Elizabeth found an entry dated July 20th, 1956. Dorothy and I have decided to do something about the beach situation. It is unconscionable that in this year of 1956, with the Supreme Court having ruled segregation unconstitutional 2 years ago, Florida still maintains separate beaches based on race. Dorothy proposed that we simply go together to Lummis Beach and refuse to leave. I agreed immediately. We have contacted Reverend Patterson, who knows a journalist willing to document the event. We understand the risks: arrest, violence, public condemnation. But Dorothy said something that has stayed with me. If not us, then who? If not now, then when? We are planning for next month. Elizabeth sat back, her hands trembling slightly. This was it. The photograph had been taken as part of a planned civil disobedience action, a deliberate challenge to Florida's segregation laws. And there was a journalist involved. Elizabeth needed to identify the other woman in the photograph. She searched through Miami archives focusing on black teachers in the Overtown neighborhood during the 1950s. After several hours of cross-referencing school records and civil rights organization membership lists, she found a promising lead. Dorothy Williams, an elementary school teacher at Booker T. Washington Elementary from 1953 to 1959. A phone call to the Miami-Dade County School District archives confirmed that Dorothy Williams had indeed worked at that school, and that she had been dismissed for conduct unbecoming a teacher in 1959. The official record provided no details, but Elizabeth knew that during the segregation era, any form of civil rights activism could result in immediate termination, especially for black teachers who were expected to maintain strict decorum and avoid controversy. Further research led Elizabeth to the archives of the Miami Times, the city's historic black newspaper. There, buried in the August 10, 1956 edition, she found a small article with the headline, "Two Women Defy Beach Segregation." The piece was brief, only 3 paragraphs, but it confirmed everything. Miss Dorothy Williams, 24, a teacher at Booker T. Washington Elementary, and Miss Catherine Reeves, 22, a student visiting from Massachusetts, were removed from Lummis Beach yesterday by Miami police after refusing to leave the whites-only section. Both women were detained for several hours but released without charges after intervention by attorneys from the NAACP. Miss Williams stated that she and Miss Reeves were exercising their constitutional rights and would continue to challenge unjust segregation laws. Elizabeth printed the article and pinned it to her research board. She then found Dorothy's photograph in a 1955 school yearbook, the same warm smile, the same intelligent eyes. But what happened to her after 1959? Elizabeth expanded her search, looking through census records, city directories, and other public documents. The trail went cold after Dorothy left Miami. There was no marriage record, no death certificate in Florida, no forwarding address. Finally, Elizabeth found a reference in the archives of the Detroit Urban League. Dorothy Williams had moved to Michigan in 1960 and had worked as a community organizer throughout the 1960s civil rights movement. She had been present at the March on Washington in 1963. She had organized voter registration drives in Detroit, and she had lived until 2015, passing away at the age of 83. Elizabeth felt a surge of emotion. Dorothy had lived a long life of activism and service, and somewhere in Detroit there might be family members, records, or documents that could fill in more of the story. Elizabeth found more diary entries from Catherine that detailed the planning of their beach protest. The entry dated August 3, 1956, revealed the careful deliberation behind what seemed like a simple act. Dorothy and I met with Reverend Patterson and 3 others from the Fellowship Church tonight. We discussed every detail of next week's beach action. Reverend Patterson warned us that the police might be violent, that we could be seriously hurt. Dorothy was calm, steady. She said she had already experienced violence just for existing as a black woman in the South. At least this violence would have a purpose. Her courage shames me. I have lived my whole life in safety and privilege. The worst thing that can happen to me is arrest and temporary discomfort. For Dorothy, the stakes are so much higher. The entry continued. We have decided on Saturday, August 11th at 4 in the afternoon. The beach will be crowded, which means more witnesses, but also more potential hostility. Harry Benson, the photographer from the Miami Herald's Negro edition, will be there. He'll position himself where he can photograph us in any police response. We will wear our swimsuits and carry towels and beach bags just like anyone else enjoying a summer day. We will walk onto the sand together, choose a spot, lay out our towels, and simply exist in that space. If approached by police, we will politely explain that we are breaking no legitimate law. The Supreme Court has ruled segregation unconstitutional. We have every legal and moral right to be there. We will not leave unless physically removed. Elizabeth cross-referenced the date with newspaper archives and found that August 11th, 1956 was indeed a Saturday. The Miami Herald's coverage the following day mentioned a minor incident at Lummis Beach involving 2 females who were escorted from the premises by police, but provided no details and no names. The deliberate vagueness told its own story. The white-owned newspapers minimized or ignored acts of civil disobedience that challenged segregation. But Catherine's diary entries from after the event provided vivid details that no newspaper captured. We arrived at the beach at 3:45. My hands were shaking as we walked from the parking area toward the water. Dorothy took my hand and squeezed it. Whatever happens, she said, we've already won just by being here together. We found a spot about 30 yards from the water. The moment we spread out our towels, I felt the change in atmosphere. Conversations around us stopped. People stared. A woman grabbed her children and moved them away, as if we carried some disease. A man shouted something crude that I will not repeat here. But we sat down, we smiled. And Harry appeared with his camera. Catherine's diary provided a minute-by-minute account of what happened next, filling in the story behind the photograph that Elizabeth had been studying. The entry continued. Harry called out to us, asking if we would stand for a photograph. We stood together, and I remember feeling a strange mixture of fear and exhilaration. The sun was warm on my skin, the ocean breeze was gentle, and beside me stood my dear friend Dorothy, brave and beautiful. For just a moment, I forgot about the hostile stares and the danger. I forgot about segregation and injustice. I simply stood on a beach with my friend, and it felt like the most natural thing in the world. But the moment did not last. As Harry snapped the photograph, I saw movement in my peripheral vision. A police officer was walking toward us, and behind him came several men in civilian clothes. Their faces were hard, angry. The officer stopped about 10 feet away and called out, "You girls need to leave. This beach is not for mixing." Dorothy stepped forward slightly, placing herself between me and the approaching men. Her voice was calm and clear. "Officer, we are not breaking any law. The Supreme Court has ruled that segregation is unconstitutional. We have every right to be here." The officer's face reddened. "I don't care what some court in Washington says. This is Miami and we have our own rules. Now move along before I arrest you both." Elizabeth found a second photograph in Catherine's collection that must have been taken moments after the first. This one showed the police officer confronting the 2 women, his hand raised in a gesture of command. Dorothy stood with her chin lifted, defiant. Catherine stood beside her, one hand reaching toward her friend as if to offer support or protection. The tension in the image was palpable. The calm determination of the two women contrasted sharply with the aggressive posture of the officer. Catherine's diary continued. We did not move. Dorothy repeated that we were breaking no legitimate law and that we would not leave voluntarily. The officer grabbed Dorothy's arm. I stepped forward and said, "If you arrest her, you'll have to arrest me too." He looked at me with contempt and said, "Oh, I intend to, sweetheart." Within minutes, 2 more officers arrived. They escorted us roughly, but not violently off the beach. The crowd watched in silence. Some seemed satisfied. Others looked uncomfortable, perhaps even ashamed. We were taken to a police station, fingerprinted, and held in separate cells for 4 hours before Reverend Patterson arrived with an NAACP attorney who secured our release. Elizabeth discovered that the beach protest was only the beginning of Catherine and Dorothy's activism. In the weeks following their arrest, both women became more deeply involved in Miami's civil rights movement, attending meetings, organizing protests, and connecting with other activists who were challenging segregation across the South. Catherine's diary entries from late August revealed the personal cost of their action. Father called from Boston yesterday. He is furious. Someone sent him a newspaper clipping about my arrest. He demanded that I return home immediately and cease this embarrassing behavior. He said I am bringing shame on the family, that people are asking him questions at his club, that Mother is distraught. I told him that I would not stop, that this is the most important work I have ever done. He hung up on me. Mother called an hour later, crying. She begged me to think of my future, my reputation, my prospects for marriage. She does not understand that I am thinking of all those things, but not in the way she means. What kind of future do I want? Not one built on the suffering and degradation of others. Dorothy's perspective came through in a letter Elizabeth found in the collection, written from Dorothy to her sister in Atlanta. Dear Ruth, I know you worry about me, but I must tell you that I have never felt more alive or more purposeful than I do now. Yes, I lost my teaching position. Yes, I have been threatened and harassed. Yes, I wake up some mornings afraid of what might happen. But I also wake up knowing that I am fighting for something larger than myself. Catherine and I have formed a bond that transcends the artificial boundaries this society tries to impose. She has shown me that not all white people accept the system of segregation, and I hope I have shown her that black people will no longer accept second-class citizenship. Together, we are stronger than we could ever be alone. Elizabeth found evidence of more beach protests throughout the fall of 1956. Catherine and Dorothy returned to Lummis Beach 3 more times, each time with a few more supporters. The group grew from 2 to 5 to 10. Local newspapers continued to ignore or minimize the protests, but the Miami Times documented each one, publishing photographs and interviews. By December, the beach protests had inspired similar actions at segregated swimming pools, parks, and public facilities across Miami, but the resistance was growing more violent. Catherine's diary entry from November 18th described an incident that left both women shaken. We were attacked today. A group of men surrounded us as we tried to enter the beach. They shouted obscenities, threw sand, and one man spit directly in Dorothy's face. She did not flinch. She stood there, dignified and calm, while this hateful man degraded himself with his action. Elizabeth discovered a gap in Catherine's diary, no entries between December 1956 and March 1957. Worried that something terrible had happened during those months, she searched through other documents in the collection and found a series of letters between Catherine and her mother that explained the silence. Catherine had been hospitalized in January 1957 after collapsing during a protest. The diagnosis was exhaustion and malnutrition. She had been working multiple jobs to support herself after her family cut off her allowance, while also devoting every spare moment to activism. Her mother had traveled to Miami and insisted Catherine return to Boston to recover. But the letters revealed something Elizabeth had not expected: Catherine's mother's transformation. In a letter dated February 14, 1957, Catherine's mother wrote, "My dear daughter, I came to Miami prepared to bring you home and convince you to abandon this dangerous path you have chosen. But after spending time with you, meeting Dorothy and the others in your group, and seeing firsthand the injustices you are fighting against, I find myself changed. I attended the Fellowship Church with you last Sunday and heard Reverend Patterson speak about the moral imperative to stand against evil. I watched Dorothy teach children in her makeshift classroom after losing her official position, and I saw the love and dedication she brings to that work. I am ashamed that I asked you to stop. I am ashamed that I prioritized comfort and reputation over justice. When you return to Miami, and I now understand that you must return, know that you have my support and my love." The reconciliation with her mother seemed to energize Catherine. When she returned to Miami in March, the diary entries resumed with renewed vigor. "Mother has done something extraordinary. She has used her connections in Boston to arrange speaking engagements for Dorothy and me at churches and universities throughout New England. We will spend April traveling, sharing our story, raising awareness and funds for the Miami movement. I never imagined my mother, who spent her life in comfortable society, would become an ally in this fight. It gives me hope that hearts can change, that people can overcome the prejudices they were raised with." The speaking tour was documented in several newspaper clippings Elizabeth found. The Boston Globe ran a feature article titled, "Radcliffe Student Challenges Segregation," with a photograph of Catherine and Dorothy standing together at a podium. The article quoted Dorothy saying, "Segregation is not just a Southern problem. It is an American problem. Every person who remains silent in the face of injustice shares responsibility for perpetuating it." Elizabeth traced Catherine and Dorothy's friendship through the following decades, piecing together the story from letters, photographs, and public records. After the speaking tour, both women continued their activism, though their paths diverged geographically. Catherine completed her degree at Radcliffe and became a civil rights attorney, working for the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. Dorothy moved to Detroit and became a community organizer, working on housing discrimination, education equity, and voter registration, but they remained in constant contact. Elizabeth found boxes of letters exchanged over 40 years, weekly at first, then monthly as their lives became busier, but never ceasing. They wrote about their work, their struggles, their victories and defeats. They wrote about personal matters, Dorothy's brief marriage and divorce, Catherine's decision to never marry, their aging parents, their health concerns. Through it all, the tone of deep friendship and mutual respect never wavered. A letter from Dorothy in 1963 showed the continued bond. "Dearest Catherine, I am writing this from a church in Birmingham, waiting to join the march tomorrow. I think of that first day on the beach in Miami 7 years ago, when we decided to simply exist together in a space that told us we could not. That small act of defiance led me here, to this movement that is finally forcing America to confront its sins. I carry you with me in every march, every sit-in, every moment of fear and courage. Our friendship taught me that solidarity across racial lines is not only possible, but essential. Thank you for being willing to risk everything to stand beside me." Catherine's response, written 2 weeks later, revealed her anguish over the violence in Birmingham. "Dorothy, I watched the news footage of the dogs and fire hoses turned on peaceful protesters, and I was physically sick. I searched every face in every photograph, terrified I would see yours among the injured. Thank God you are safe. I am coming to Birmingham. I cannot sit in my comfortable office in New York while you and others face such brutality. My legal skills may be useful, but more than that, my presence is the least I can offer. We stood together on that beach 7 years ago, and we will stand together now." Elizabeth found photographs from the Birmingham campaign showing Catherine and Dorothy working side by side, registering voters, organizing legal support for arrested protesters, and documenting the violence inflicted by authorities. The images showed them older now, no longer the carefree young women on the beach, but seasoned activists with determination etched into their faces. Elizabeth compiled all her research into a comprehensive report and prepared an exhibition for the Smithsonian titled, "Friendship as Resistance: The Story of Catherine and Dorothy." The centerpiece was the original 1956 beach photograph, displayed alongside Catherine's diary entries, Dorothy's letters, newspaper clippings, and photographs documenting their decades of activism and friendship. At the exhibition opening, Elizabeth stood before a crowd of historians, civil rights veterans, and members of both women's families. She had located Catherine's niece and Dorothy's grandson, both of whom had provided additional materials and stories for the exhibition. "This photograph," Elizabeth began, gesturing to the large print behind her, "appears to show a simple moment, two friends enjoying a day at the beach. But when we examine it closely, when we study the hostile figures in the background, and understand the context in which it was taken, we see something far more profound. We see an act of resistance. We see two women who refused to accept the artificial boundaries of segregation, who risked their safety and futures to demonstrate that friendship and equality could exist despite laws and customs designed to prevent them." She continued, "Catherine and Dorothy's friendship was not just personal, it was political. By simply existing together in spaces that forbade integration, by standing shoulder to shoulder in the face of hatred and violence, they challenged the very foundations of segregation. This photograph, taken by journalist Harry Benson moments before they were arrested, became a document of that challenge. It circulated quietly through civil rights networks, inspiring others to take similar actions. It appeared in the Miami Times and in newsletters for integrated churches across the South. It was evidence that resistance was possible, that solidarity across racial lines could be real and powerful. Dorothy's grandson Michael spoke next. He held a framed letter his grandmother had written shortly before her death in 2015. Grandmother wrote this to Catherine, who had died 6 months earlier. She never sent it, but she asked me to read it at her funeral. I'd like to share part of it now, my dearest Catherine. I am writing to you, though you are gone, because I cannot stop talking to you. For nearly 60 years, you were my sister, my ally, my conscience, and my joy. What we began on that Miami beach in 1956 changed both our lives, set us on paths we never could have imagined. But more than that, it proved something I have held on to through every difficult moment since: love is stronger than hate. Friendship is stronger than prejudice, and ordinary people doing brave things can change the world. Thank you for seeing me, truly seeing me, in an era when most white people looked through black people as if we were invisible. Thank you for standing with me. Thank you for a lifetime of friendship that defied every rule designed to keep us apart. The room was silent for a moment after Michael finished reading. Then Catherine's niece, Jennifer, stood and walked to the photograph. She touched it gently, her fingers tracing the outline of her aunt's face. Aunt Catherine kept a copy of this photograph on her desk for her entire life, Jennifer said softly. When I was a child, I asked her about it. She told me it was a picture of the moment she learned what courage really meant, not the absence of fear, but the choice to act despite fear. She said Dorothy taught her that, and that it was the most valuable lesson of her life. Elizabeth concluded the evening by revealing the final piece of her research: the identities of some of the hostile figures in the background of the photograph. Through extensive archival work and facial recognition comparison with other historical photographs, she had identified 3 of the watching men as known members of white supremacist groups active in Miami during the 1950s. One was later arrested for violence against civil rights protesters. Another had written letters to newspapers defending segregation with increasingly extreme rhetoric. By identifying these figures, Elizabeth explained, we complete the story this photograph tells. We see not just the courage of Catherine and Dorothy, but the active resistance they faced from those invested in maintaining white supremacy. This photograph captures a moment of confrontation between 2 visions of America: one based on racial hierarchy and segregation, the other based on equality and integration. We know which vision ultimately prevailed, though the struggle continues, and we know that it prevailed in part because of ordinary people like Catherine and Dorothy, who refused to accept injustice and who demonstrated through their friendship that a different world was possible. The exhibition ran for 6 months and became one of the most visited in the Smithsonian's history. The photograph was reproduced in textbooks, featured in documentaries, and shared widely on social media. Catherine and Dorothy's story reached millions of people who had never heard of their beach protests or their decades of activism. But perhaps the most meaningful impact was personal. After the exhibition opened, Elizabeth received dozens of letters from people who had been inspired by the story. Young people wrote about finding the courage to stand up against injustice in their own communities. Elderly people wrote about their own memories of the civil rights era, sharing stories that had never been documented. Most movingly, several people wrote about interracial friendships in their own lives, friendships that had been tested by family disapproval, social pressure, or outright hostility, but had endured. One letter from a woman in her 70s read, I saw your exhibition yesterday and wept. In 1959, I was best friends with a black girl in my high school in Alabama. My parents forbade me from seeing her outside of school. I was 17 and a coward. I chose my parents' approval over my friend's dignity. I have regretted that choice every day for 60 years. Seeing what Catherine and Dorothy were willing to risk, seeing the beautiful friendship they built and maintained across a lifetime, has given me the courage to finally try to find my old friend and apologize. Thank you for bringing this story to light. It is never too late to choose courage over comfort. Elizabeth kept that letter pinned to her office wall, a reminder of why the work of recovering and preserving these hidden histories mattered. The photograph of 2 young women standing together on a beach in 1956, smiling despite the dangers surrounding them, had become more than a historical artifact. It had become a symbol of resistance, friendship, and the enduring power of ordinary people to create extraordinary change. As Elizabeth looked at the photograph one more time, she thought about Catherine's words from one of her final diary entries. Written in 2014, a year before her death. People sometimes ask me if I have regrets about the path my life took, the family conflicts, the arrests, the threats, the years of struggle with so little recognition or reward. I tell them I have only one regret, that Dorothy and I did not meet sooner, that we did not have even more years of friendship than the 60 we were blessed to share. Everything else, every sacrifice, every difficult moment was worth it. We changed things in small ways and sometimes in larger ones, but more importantly, we proved that love and friendship could transcend the barriers society erected. We lived as if the world we wanted already existed, and in doing so, we helped bring that world a little bit closer to reality.